Hi, my name is Samantha. I sat at my kitchen table staring at a letter from the IRS that confirmed what I'd suspected for years. My stepfather's business wasn't just successful, it was built on a massive tax fraud scheme. After 20 years of watching my mother choose him over me time and again, including the night she abandoned me at my lowest moment, I finally had the evidence I needed. They thought my silence meant surrender. They were about to find out it didn't. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It all started on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening in Portland, the kind of relentless downpour that makes the city lights blur and stretch across the wet pavement like watercolor paintings. I had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift at Memorial Hospital, where I worked as a trauma nurse, my scrubs still faintly smelling of antiseptic and exhaustion. My apartment was only a 15-minute drive, but the storm made everything feel farther away, more isolated. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend Olivia. "Don't forget dinner tomorrow. I've got news," I smiled, typing back that I wouldn't miss it for the world. Despite the bone-deep tiredness, I felt a small flicker of anticipation. Olivia had hinted at a promotion, and celebrating her success would be a bright spot in what had been a difficult month. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I couldn't help but notice the sleek black Mercedes parked in the visitor spot, my mother's car. She never visited unannounced. My stomach tightened as I killed the engine, raindrops hammering against the roof in a chaotic rhythm that matched my suddenly racing pulse. I found her waiting in the hallway outside my door, designer coat perfectly pressed despite the weather, not a hair out of place. Her smile was practiced, the kind she wore at Richard's business functions. "Samantha, darling," she said, kissing the air beside my cheek. "I've been trying to reach you all day." The familiar scent of her expensive perfume brought back a flood of memories. Standing alone at high school graduation while she attended Richard's award ceremony, calling her from college when my scholarship fell through only to hear, "Richard says you should have applied for more." The endless parade of missed birthdays and hollow promises. "I was working," I said simply, unlocking my door. 12-hour shift. "My phone stays in my locker." She followed me inside, her eyes scanning my modest apartment with that barely concealed look of disappointment I'd grown so accustomed to. I'd learned to stop expecting anything else years ago, but the sting never quite went away. "Richard and I wanted to invite you to the house this weekend," she said, settling primly on the edge of my sofa. "It's his company's 20th anniversary, and he's having a celebration. All the important people will be there." I stood in my tiny kitchen, filling the kettle, letting the mundane task anchor me. "I have to work," I lied. The truth was I couldn't bear another evening of standing in the corner, watching my mother orbit Richard like he was the sun, introducing me as an afterthought, if at all. "You can't keep using work as an excuse forever, Samantha." Her voice had that edge to it, sharp enough to cut. "Richard has been generous to you. He paid for your nursing school, remember?" The kettle whistled, and I poured hot water over a tea bag, watching it bleed color into the cup. "No, Mom, I paid for nursing school. I worked 3 jobs and took out loans." Richard offered once, then forgot. When the bill came due, her face tightened. "You always do this. You twist things to make him look bad." I took a deep breath, cradling the warm mug between my palms. This was the dance we'd been doing for 20 years, since she'd married Richard when I was 10. I'd stopped expecting her to choose me over him long ago, but some small, foolish part of me still hoped she might at least see me. "I appreciate the invitation," I said carefully, "but I really can't make it." She stood abruptly, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her skirt. "This is important to me, Samantha. Just once. Could you put aside whatever grudge you're holding and be there for your family?" Family. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with all the ways it had been hollowed out over the years. In my mind, family wasn't annual Christmas cards, where Richard stood front and center, my mother tucked under his arm, me positioned off to the side like an awkward afterthought. Family wasn't being told at 16 that there wasn't room for me at their new house in the hills, that the boarding school would be better for my future anyway. Quote, "I'll think about it," I said finally, knowing I wouldn't go, knowing she knew it too. She nodded stiffly and gathered her purse. At the door, she paused. Richard's been under a lot of stress lately. The IRS is doing some routine audit. Nothing serious, but you know how he gets. Her eyes found mine, something almost like vulnerability flickering there for a moment. It would mean a lot if you were there. After she left, I sat in the quiet of my apartment, rain still beating against the windows. The mention of the IRS audit tugged at something in my mind. It wasn't the first time Richard had been stressed about his finances. Over the years, I'd caught fragments of hushed conversations, seen the way he'd shuffle papers away when anyone entered his home office, noticed how he always paid for everything in cash, despite the platinum cards in his wallet. I'd been 16 when I first suspected something wasn't right. I'd needed a form for my college applications and had slipped into his office to use the printer. A spreadsheet had been left open on his computer, 2 columns of numbers that didn't match, with a third column showing the difference. Even at 16, I'd understood enough to know what I was looking at wasn't above board. When I'd asked my mother about it later, she'd dismissed me with a tight smile. Richard's business is complicated, Samantha. Don't worry about things you don't understand. But I did understand. I understood that my mother had married a man whose moral compass pointed wherever was most convenient. I understood that she'd chosen his comfort over my safety time and again. And I understood that despite it all, some small part of me still craved her approval, her love, her choosing me just once. I sipped my cooling tea and made a decision. I would go to the anniversary party. Not for Richard, not even for my mother really, but for myself, to see with clear eyes what I'd been trying not to see for 20 years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next evening, I met Olivia at our favorite Thai restaurant, tucked away in a quiet corner of downtown. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city with that fresh, clean scent that made even the concrete feel renewed. Olivia waved excitedly from our usual booth, her curly hair pulled back, her smile wide and genuine in a way my mother's never was. "You look exhausted," she said as I slid into the booth across from her. "Double shift again?" I nodded, gratefully accepting the glass of water she pushed toward me. And then my mother showed up at my apartment. Olivia's eyebrows shot up. She'd been my roommate in college, had witnessed firsthand the painful phone calls and the holidays I'd spent at her family's house because mine didn't have room for me. What did she want this time? "To invite me to Richard's company anniversary party," I said, studying the menu I already knew by heart. "Apparently the IRS is auditing him, and she wants me there for moral support." "Are you going to go?" Olivia asked carefully. I set the menu down and met her eyes. "I think I am, but not for the reasons she wants." Olivia understood immediately. She always did. "You think there's something to find?" It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "I know there is. I've known since I was 16. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Just be careful, Sam. Richard has a lot of connections in this city." I squeezed back, grateful for her concern. "Enough about my family drama, tell me your news." Her face lit up. "I got the promotion. Senior project manager, with a team of my own." We spent the rest of dinner celebrating her success, and for a few hours I was able to push thoughts of my mother and Richard to the back of my mind. But later, as I drove home through the quiet streets, those thoughts crept forward again. I remembered the night my father died, when I was 8 years old, the way my mother had held me as we both cried, promising we'd always have each other. 2 years later, she'd met Richard, and slowly, I'd felt her slipping away. By the time I was 12, it was clear there was only room for one person at the center of her world, and it wasn't me. The memory that always cut deepest happened when I was 17. I'd been driving home from a study group when another car ran a red light, smashing into the driver's side of my second-hand Honda. I remembered the sound of metal crushing, the airbag deploying with a force that knocked the breath from my lungs, the taste of blood in my mouth. At the hospital, concussed and with a broken arm, I'd called my mother. "Can you come get me?" I'd asked, voice shaking. There was an accident. There had been a pause, the murmur of voices in the background. Then her response, the words that would echo in my mind for years to come. "I can't tonight, sweetheart. Richard's hosting the governor for dinner. Can you call an Uber?" A governor's dinner over her injured daughter. It had been the clearest message yet about where I stood in her priorities. I pulled into my apartment complex, turned off the engine, and sat in the darkness for a long moment. Then I reached for my phone and pulled up my mother's number. "I'll be there," I texted. "For the anniversary party. What time should I arrive?" Her response came almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting. 6 p.m. sharp. Wear something appropriate. I didn't bother asking what appropriate meant. I knew it meant expensive, elegant, something that would reflect well on them. I also knew I'd wear exactly what I wanted to wear. As I got ready for bed that night, I found myself thinking about my father. He'd been an accountant, meticulous and honest to a fault. "Numbers don't lie, Sammy," he used to tell me. "People lie, but numbers always tell the truth if you know how to read them." I wondered what he would think of the man my mother had married, of the life she'd chosen. More than that, I wondered what he would think of me, of the silence I'd maintained for so long. In the quiet darkness of my bedroom, I made myself a promise. I would go to that party not as the afterthought daughter, not as the inconvenient reminder of my mother's past, but as my father's daughter. Someone who knew that numbers don't lie, and who wasn't afraid of the truth they told. The week leading up to the anniversary party crawled by in a blur of hospital shifts and restless nights. Each evening, I found myself digging through old boxes I'd kept from my teenage years, searching for something I wasn't even sure still existed. On Friday night, I finally found it, a thumb drive tucked into the lining of an old journal. My hands trembled slightly as I plugged it into my laptop. It contained exactly what I remembered. Screenshots I'd taken that day in Richard's office. The spreadsheet with its damning columns of numbers. I'd kept it all these years, not sure what I'd ever do with it, but unable to throw away what felt like the only solid evidence of what I'd always known about my stepfather. I spent hours that night researching, reading everything I could find about business tax fraud, about the statute of limitations, about what constituted evidence. By the time morning light filtered through my blinds, I had a plan. Not a perfect one, but a start. The day of the party dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect early summer day that seemed to mock my churning thoughts. I chose my outfit carefully, a simple black dress that was elegant without being showy, professional rather than glamorous. I pulled my hair back into a sleek ponytail and kept my makeup minimal. I wasn't there to impress anyone. Before leaving, I slipped the thumb drive into my purse alongside a small recorder. Oregon was a one-party consent state for recordings. I'd checked. Twice. Richard and my mother's house sat on a hill, overlooking the city, all glass and angles and calculated impressiveness. As I drove up the winding driveway, I counted at least 30 cars already parked by valets in crisp uniforms. My 10-year-old Honda looked painfully out of place among the luxury vehicles. A valet opened my door with a polite smile that didn't quite mask his surprise at the car. I handed him my keys and walked toward the house, my heartbeat steady despite the anxiety buzzing just under my skin. Inside, the house was transformed. Floral arrangements taller than me adorned every surface. Soft lighting cast everything in a flattering glow, and the murmur of conversation mixed with the gentle notes of a string quartet playing in the corner. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and scanned the room. I spotted my mother immediately. She always had that effect, drawing eyes no matter where she was. Tonight, she wore a deep blue gown that matched Richard's tie, her hair swept up elegantly, diamonds glittering at her throat and ears. She was smiling at something an older man in an expensive suit was saying, her hand resting lightly on Richard's arm. Richard looked exactly as he always did, confident, controlled, every inch the successful businessman. Only someone who knew him well would notice the tightness around his eyes, the way his smile didn't quite reach them, the subtle tension in his shoulders. I stayed near the edge of the room, sipping my champagne slowly, watching. It was nearly an hour before my mother noticed me. Her eyes widened slightly in surprise. Perhaps she hadn't expected me to actually come, before she made her way toward me, dragging Richard along. "Samantha, you made it," she said, air-kissing my cheek. "Richard, look who's here." Richard's smile was perfunctory, his handshake brief. "Samantha. Glad you could join us." I wouldn't miss it, I said, meeting his eyes directly. 20 years is quite an achievement. Something flickered in his gaze. Wariness, perhaps, before he masked it with another practiced smile. Indeed it is. If you'll excuse me, I need to greet the Hendersons. He slipped away into the crowd, leaving me alone with my mother. She looked me over critically. You could have made more of an effort, Samantha. This is an important night. I came, Mom. That's the effort. She sighed. That familiar sound of disappointment I'd heard so many times. Would it kill you to try? Just once? Before I could answer, she was called away by one of her friends, leaving me standing alone with my half-empty glass of champagne. I set it down on a nearby table and began to move through the party with purpose. Richard's home office was on the second floor, off-limits to guests according to the discreet velvet rope blocking the staircase. I waited until the security guard stationed there was distracted by a waiter dropping a tray, then slipped past the rope and up the stairs. The hallway was dark, all the party's light and noise confined to the lower level. I moved silently, counting doors until I reached the one I remembered. Heavy oak with a brushed steel handle. I tried it, not surprised to find it locked. From my purse, I pulled out a small kit, a graduation gift from Olivia's brother, who worked as a locksmith. Everyone should know how to get themselves out of a jam, he'd said with a wink. I'd never used it before tonight, had practiced only on my own apartment door, but my fingers moved with surprising steadiness as I worked the lock. A soft click and the door swung open. I slipped inside, closing it quietly behind me. Richard's office was exactly as I remembered it. Meticulous, expensive, everything in its place. A large desk dominated one wall. Bookshelves filled with legal texts and business books lined another, and a small sitting area with leather chairs occupied the third. The fourth wall was all windows, overlooking the city lights now twinkling in the early evening darkness. I moved to the desk first, turning on the small lamp rather than the overhead lights. His computer sat in the center, asleep but not off. I tapped the keyboard, and the screen came to life, asking for a password. I smiled slightly to myself. Richard had used the same password for everything since I'd known him. His first dog's name, followed by his birth year. Narcissistic and predictable. I typed it in, and the computer unlocked, revealing dozens of open spreadsheets and documents. I worked quickly, methodically, the thumb drive from my purse now plugged into his computer. I copied files, took screenshots, downloaded emails. Every damning piece of evidence I could find. And there was plenty: false invoices, offshore accounts, systematic underreporting of income year after year. The scale of it was staggering. I was so absorbed in what I was seeing that I almost missed the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Almost. I quickly shut down the programs I'd been using, pocketed my thumb drive and moved to the sitting area, picking up a framed photo from an end table just as the door opened. Richard stood in the doorway, his face a mask of controlled anger. "What are you doing in here?" I held up the photo, a family portrait from years ago, my mother and Richard front and center, me off to the side as always. "Just reminiscing," I said calmly. "Nice party." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "This area is off-limits to guests." Am I a guest, Richard? Or family? You've never quite made that clear. His eyes narrowed. "What do you want, Samantha? Money? Is that why you're suddenly interested in attending our events?" I set the photo down and faced him fully. "Not everyone is motivated by money." "In my experience," he said coldly, "everyone has a price." "That says more about you than it does about me." He moved closer, his expensive cologne filling the space between us. "Let me be clear. I don't know what game you're playing, but it ends now. Your mother may tolerate your attitude, but I never have." I stood my ground, though my heart was racing. "No games, Richard, just the truth. And the truth is you've been playing with fire for 20 years. His face paled slightly, but his voice remained steady. "I don't know what you're talking about." I smiled, the expression feeling foreign on my face. "The IRS audit. I'm sure it's just routine, like Mom said. Nothing to worry about, unless of course there's something to find." We stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills, neither of us moving. Finally he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "You should leave." Now. I was just going, I replied, moving toward the door. As I passed him, I added quietly, "By the way, you should really use a more complex password. Bandit 1967 is a bit obvious." The color drained from his face as I slipped past him and out the door, my purse heavy with the weight of 20 years of fraud copied onto one small thumb drive. I made my way downstairs, past the security guard who was now back at his post, and through the crowded main floor. I spotted my mother across the room, laughing at something one of her friends had said. For a moment, our eyes met, and something passed between us. A question from her, a finality from me. I didn't say goodbye. I simply turned and walked out the front door, handed my ticket to the valet, and waited for my car. As I stood there, Richard appeared at the entrance, his face composed once more, but his eyes burning with rage. He watched me, and I watched him right back, neither of us looking away until my car arrived. As I drove down the winding driveway and away from the house on the hill, I felt something shift inside me. A weight lifting? A decision made. The thumb drive in my purse held enough evidence to destroy Richard's carefully constructed life, to bring down the empire he'd built on lies and fraud. It held the power to finally make my mother see the man she'd chosen over me for 20 years. But more than that, it held my freedom. Freedom from hoping she'd change. Freedom from the shadow of always being second best. Freedom from the silence I'd maintained for far too long. I drove through the night, the city lights blurring through unshed tears. Not tears of sadness, but of release. Tomorrow, I would take the evidence to the IRS. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, for the first time in 20 years, I was choosing myself. I drove home from Richard's party with purpose, the thumb drive burning a hole in my purse. Each mile that separated me from that house on the hill made my breathing easier, like I was finally emerging from underwater after years of drowning. The Portland skyline glittered against the night sky, a constellation of possibilities I'd never allowed myself to see before. When I reached my apartment, I didn't immediately go inside. Instead, I sat in my car, fingers gripping the steering wheel, and let 20 years of memories wash over me. The countless times my mother had chosen Richard over me. The way he'd systematically pushed me to the margins of their life until I was barely visible. The night of my car accident, when neither of them came, I remembered my father's voice, gentle but firm. "Numbers don't lie, Sammy. People do." I thought of the evidence I now possessed. Years of meticulously documented fraud that would bring Richard's empire crumbling down. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. About truth. About finally standing up for the values my father had instilled in me before he was taken too soon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My apartment felt different when I finally went inside, as if the decision I'd made had already begun to transform the space around me. I kicked off my shoes, hung my dress in the closet, and changed into comfortable clothes. Then I sat at my small desk, plugged in the thumb drive, and began to organize what I'd found. The evidence was overwhelming. Richard had been running 2 sets of books for his real estate development company for years. One for the IRS showing modest profits, and one for investors showing substantial returns. He'd created shell companies to hide assets, fabricated expenses, and systematically underreported income. The fraud went back the full 20 years of the company's existence and totaled millions of dollars. As I sorted through spreadsheets and emails, a notification popped up on my phone. A text from my mother. "Your early departure was noticed. Richard is upset. Call me tomorrow." No question about why I'd left. No concern for my well-being. Just Richard's feelings, as always. I didn't respond. Instead, I continued organizing the evidence, creating a timeline of the fraud, identifying key documents that showed intent. By the time I finally went to bed, the sun was peeking over the horizon, painting my bedroom walls with soft golden light. Despite not sleeping, I felt more awake than I had in years. When I woke a few hours later, my phone was filled with missed calls and increasingly angry texts from my mother. The final one read simply, "Richard knows you took something from his office." Whatever you think you're doing, stop now. So he'd checked his computer, realized I'd accessed his files. I'd expected that. What I hadn't expected was the flutter of doubt that suddenly gripped me. Was I really prepared to do this? To potentially send my stepfather to prison? To destroy my relationship with my mother forever? I made coffee and stood by my window, watching the city come alive below. People rushing to work, to school, to lives untouched by the decision weighing on me. I thought of my hospital colleagues, the patients I cared for. How many of them had faced crossroads like this? My phone rang again. My mother. This time, I answered. "What did you take?" she demanded without preamble. "Evidence," I said simply. There was a long pause. When she spoke again, her voice had that carefully controlled quality I recognized from childhood, the tone that meant she was furious but trying to hide it. Evidence of what exactly? Tax fraud, Mom, 20 years of it. Millions of dollars. Another pause, longer this time. I could almost see her processing, calculating, trying to find the angle that would best serve her purposes. "Samantha?" she finally said, softer now. "You've misunderstood something. Richard's business dealings are complex, but everything he does is perfectly legal. If you've taken confidential documents, that's corporate theft. You could face charges." I almost laughed at the irony. "Are you threatening me because I have evidence of actual crimes?" "I'm trying to protect you," she insisted. "Whatever you think you found, you're wrong. Come to the house, bring whatever you took, we'll discuss this as a family." Family. There it was again, that word that had lost all meaning between us. "I can't do that," I said quietly. "Can't or won't." The edge had returned to her voice. "Both," I answered truthfully. "I've made my decision." "And what decision is that?" I took a deep breath. "I'm taking the evidence to the IRS on Monday morning." The silence that followed was deafening. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but filled with a cold fury I'd never heard before. "If you do this, you are no longer my daughter. Do you understand that? You will be dead to me." The words should have devastated me. Instead, I felt an odd sense of calm. "I've been dead to you for 20 years, Mom. The only difference now is we're both acknowledging it." I ended the call before she could respond and blocked her number. Then I called Olivia. "I need a place to stay for a few days," I told her when she answered. "And I might need a lawyer." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Olivia lived in a converted warehouse loft downtown, all exposed brick and industrial fixtures softened by colorful textiles and plants. When I arrived with a suitcase and my laptop bag containing the thumb drive, she didn't ask questions right away. She simply hugged me, led me to her guest room, and made us both tea. We sat at her kitchen island, steam rising from our mugs, as I told her everything. The party, sneaking into Richard's office, the evidence I'd found, my mother's threat. "Are you sure about this?" she asked when I finished. "Once you go to the IRS, there's no taking it back." I nodded. "I've been silent for 20 years, Liv. Watching him manipulate everyone around him, including my mother. Watching him break the law while pretending to be this pillar of the community. I can't be silent anymore." She reached across the island and squeezed my hand. "Then I'm with you. My cousin Marcus is a lawyer. He specializes in whistleblower cases. I'll call him tomorrow." That night I slept better than I had in years, as if the decision to finally speak the truth had lifted a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. In the morning, Olivia made waffles, and we sat on her balcony eating breakfast and planning next steps. Marcus, her lawyer cousin, agreed to meet us that afternoon. He was younger than I expected, with kind eyes behind stylish glasses and a quiet confidence that immediately put me at ease. "So you have evidence of tax fraud," he said after I'd explained the situation. "And you obtained this evidence by accessing your stepfather's computer without permission." I nodded, suddenly worried. "Is that going to be a problem? Legally, I mean?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering. "It complicates things, but it doesn't necessarily invalidate the evidence." The IRS has a whistleblower program specifically for reporting tax fraud. They're more concerned with the information than how it was obtained, especially for cases of this magnitude. What about Richard? Could he press charges against me? He could try, Marcus admitted, but it would be risky for him. Any legal action against you would draw attention to why you took the documents in the first place. Most people in his position would prefer to avoid that spotlight. I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. What do we do next? First, we need to back up that thumb drive, multiple copies, stored securely. Then we prepare a formal submission to the IRS whistleblower office. I'll help you draft it. He paused, his expression serious. You should also know that whistleblower cases can take time, sometimes years. And there's a possibility of a financial reward if the IRS collects based on your information. I don't care about a reward, I said quickly. I just want the truth to come out. Marcus smiled slightly. Nonetheless, if they recover the taxes owed, you could be entitled to a percentage. Consider it compensation for the risk you're taking. As we left his office with a plan in place, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I opened it to find a message from Richard. Whatever you think you're doing, it's not too late to stop. Name your price. I showed it to Olivia, who frowned. How did he get your number? I thought you blocked your mom. I did, I said, a chill running through me. He must have gotten a new phone or something. You should show this to Marcus, she said. It could be considered witness tampering. I nodded, forwarding the message to Marcus before blocking the number. But the unease lingered. Richard had resources, connections. If he was willing to text me directly, what else might he do? That night, as Olivia and I were making dinner, there was a knock at her door. We exchanged glances, neither of us expecting anyone. Olivia went to check the peephole and stepped back, her face pale. It's your mother, she whispered. My heart raced. How did she know I was here? Olivia shook her head. I don't know. Should I tell her to leave? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. No. I'll talk to her. When Olivia opened the door, my mother swept in like a storm, designer handbag clutched in white-knuckled hands, eyes red-rimmed but fierce. She looked smaller somehow, less imposing than she had at the party, but no less determined. What do you want? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. She glanced at Olivia, then back to me. I need to speak with you. Alone. Olivia crossed her arms. This is my home, and Samantha is my guest. I'm not leaving her alone with you. My mother's jaw tightened, but she nodded curtly. Fine. Samantha, please. Whatever you think you know about Richard's business, you're mistaken. Come home. Bring whatever you took. We can fix this before it goes too far. It's already gone too far, I said quietly. 20 years too far. Is that what this is about? Some childhood grudge? You're willing to destroy our family over perceived slights from the past? I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Perceived slights? You chose him over me at every turn, Mom. Every single time I needed you, you picked him. The night of my accident, you couldn't even be bothered to come to the hospital because he was hosting a dinner party. She flinched, just slightly. That's not fair. You were fine, the doctor said. I was alone and scared and bleeding. I cut in, the memory still sharp enough to steal my breath. And you chose a dinner party. Just like you've always chosen him, his needs, his wants, his crimes. Crimes? She echoed, her voice rising. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? I moved to Olivia's dining table where my laptop sat open, the screen showing one of the spreadsheets I'd copied from Richard's computer. 2 sets of books, Mom. One for the IRS, one for investors. Offshore accounts. Shell companies. Does any of this look legal to you? She approached slowly, her eyes scanning the screen. For a moment, genuine shock registered on her face before she carefully composed her features again. Richard has explanations for all of this. Business arrangements you don't understand. Then let him explain them to the IRS, I said simply. She stared at me, something shifting in her expression. For the first time, I saw fear in my mother's eyes. Not just anger or disappointment, but real fear. You don't understand what you're doing, she said, her voice lower now. If this comes out, we'll lose everything. You mean Richard will lose everything? We are a family, Samantha. What happens to him happens to me. To us. I shook my head. We haven't been a family in a very long time, Mom. Maybe we never were. She stepped closer, reaching for my hand. I let her take it, surprised by the tremble in her fingers. Please, she whispered. If not for Richard, then for me. Don't do this. For a moment, I wavered. The little girl inside me, who had always craved her approval, her love, surged forward, desperate to please. But then I thought of the evidence on my computer, of 20 years of lies and fraud, of all the times she'd chosen Richard over me. I'm sorry, I said, gently pulling my hand away. But this time I'm choosing the truth. Her face hardened, the vulnerability vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Then you leave me no choice. She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, tossing it onto the table between us. A cease and desist letter from our attorney. If you proceed with these false allegations, we will sue you for defamation, corporate espionage, and theft of confidential information. I stared at the envelope, not touching it. More threats. That's your answer to everything, isn't it? It's not a threat, it's a promise. She picked up her purse, her movements precise and controlled once more. You have 24 hours to return everything you took and sign an NDA. After that, our lawyers will take action. After she left, Olivia and I sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Finally, Olivia spoke. Are you okay? I nodded slowly, though okay wasn't quite the right word. I felt hollow, emptied out, but also strangely calm. I need to call Marcus. The next morning, Marcus arrived at Olivia's loft with another attorney, an older woman named Eleanor, who specialized in tax law. We spread the evidence across Olivia's dining table as Eleanor examined it, her expression growing increasingly grim. This is extensive, she said finally, looking up at me. Your stepfather has been very busy for a very long time. Is it enough? I asked. She nodded. More than enough to trigger a full investigation. The cease and desist is just intimidation. They're hoping you'll back down. I won't, I said firmly. Good. Eleanor replied with a small smile. Because I've spent my career putting people like your stepfather behind bars, and I'd very much like to add him to the list. Marcus looked at his watch. The IRS whistleblower office opens in an hour. We have your statement prepared, copies of all the evidence and the necessary forms. Are you ready to do this? I thought of my father, of his unwavering belief in doing what was right, even when it was difficult. I thought of all the years I'd stayed silent, watching Richard build his empire on lies while my mother enabled him at every turn. I thought of the text message from the night of my accident, the 5 words that had made it perfectly clear where I stood in their priorities. I'm ready, I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. The IRS building was imposing, all glass and steel and bureaucratic efficiency. As we rode the elevator to the 11th floor where the whistleblower office was located, my heart pounded in my chest, but my resolve never wavered. This was the right thing to do, the necessary thing. The meeting itself was surprisingly anticlimactic. A serious-faced agent took our statement and evidence, asked a series of detailed questions about how I'd obtained the information, and explained the process moving forward. They would evaluate the submission, determine if it met the criteria for further investigation, and contact us with their decision. And if they decide to investigate? I asked. Then they'll assign a team, Eleanor explained as we left the building. They'll examine the evidence, possibly audit your stepfather's business, and determine whether to pursue civil penalties, criminal charges, or both. How long will all that take? Months at minimum, possibly years for the full resolution. She squeezed my arm gently. This is a marathon, not a sprint, Samantha. Are you prepared for that? I nodded. I've been silent for 20 years. I can be patient a little longer. As we parted ways outside the building, Marcus reminded me of the importance of discretion. Don't discuss this with anyone. Don't respond to any communication from your mother or stepfather. And if anything unusual happens, if you feel you're being followed or threatened in any way, call me immediately. His words sent a chill through me, a reminder that what I'd just done carried real risk. Richard had money, power, connections. He wouldn't go down without a fight. Back at Olivia's loft, I felt both drained and exhilarated. I'd done it. After 20 years of watching from the sidelines as Richard built his empire on fraud and my mother chose him over me time and again, I'd finally taken action. Whatever happened next, at least I'd broken my silence. Olivia poured us both a glass of wine to celebrate, raising her glass in a toast. To doing the right thing, even when it's hard. I clinked my glass against hers, the weight of the day settling around me like a heavy cloak. To the truth, I added softly, whatever it costs. Neither of us could have guessed just how high that cost would be. 3 days after filing the whistleblower report, I returned to my apartment, against Olivia's protests. You can stay with me as long as you need, she insisted, helping me pack my things. What if Richard tries something? I zipped my suitcase and gave her a reassuring smile. Marcus said the best thing I can do is maintain my normal routine. If I hide away, it looks like I have something to fear. You do have something to fear, Olivia pointed out. Your stepfather is a powerful man with a lot to lose. She wasn't wrong, but I couldn't hide at her place forever. I've installed new locks, I reminded her. And Marcus helped me set up security cameras. I'll be fine. The truth was, I needed my own space to process everything that had happened. The enormity of what I'd done, reporting Richard to the IRS, effectively declaring war on my only remaining family, was still sinking in. I needed quiet to think, to plan, to prepare for whatever came next. My apartment felt different when I returned, both familiar and strange, as if it belonged to someone else, someone braver than I had been before. I unpacked slowly, checking my new security system, drawing comfort from the soft whir of the camera by my door. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. That evening, I made myself dinner and sat at my small kitchen table, scrolling through job listings on my laptop. Marcus had suggested I consider finding work outside Portland, somewhere Richard's influence couldn't reach. The thought of leaving, of starting over somewhere new, was both terrifying and exhilarating. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My heart stuttered until I opened it and saw it was from Eleanor, the tax attorney. IRS confirmed receipt of our submission. Investigation officially opened. Stay vigilant. I exhaled slowly, relief mingling with a fresh wave of anxiety. It was really happening. The wheels of justice were turning, slowly but inexorably. I wondered if Richard knew yet, if he'd been contacted by IRS agents, if my mother was standing beside him as he received the news, her face a mask of loyal concern. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I tossed and turned, haunted by memories and worries in equal measure. When I finally drifted off near dawn, my dreams were filled with spreadsheets and numbers that morphed into my mother's face, her eyes cold and accusing. My alarm jolted me awake at 6. I had a shift at the hospital starting at 8, my first since filing the report. Part of me wanted to call in sick, to hide away until the storm I'd created had passed. But that wasn't who I was. That wasn't who my father had raised me to be. Do what's right even when it's hard, he used to tell me. Especially when it's hard. So I showered, dressed in my scrubs, and made coffee, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety in my stomach. Just as I was about to leave, my phone rang. The hospital's number. Samantha? It was Helen, my supervisor. I'm afraid I have some uncomfortable news. My grip tightened on the phone. What's wrong? We've received complaints about you from some very influential board members. The knot in my stomach twisted painfully. What kind of complaints? She sighed, her discomfort evident even through the phone. Allegations of unprofessional conduct, medication errors, falsified charts. Serious things, Samantha. Things we have to investigate. That's ridiculous, I said, my voice rising. None of that is true. You know me, Helen. I'm a good nurse. I've never made those kinds of mistakes. I know, she said quietly, which is why this is so troubling. But my hands are tied. Until we complete an investigation, you're suspended with pay. Richard. It had to be. The hospital board was filled with Portland's elite, exactly the circles where he wielded influence. This was his first countermove, attacking my livelihood, my reputation. How long will the investigation take? Quote, I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. A few weeks at minimum, Helen replied. I'm sorry, Samantha. For what it's worth, I don't believe the allegations. But process is process. After hanging up, I sank onto my couch, still clutching my phone. Richard had struck faster than I'd anticipated, and in a way I hadn't expected. Not direct threats or legal action, but something more insidious, undermining the career I'd built, the identity I'd forged, separate from him and my mother. I called Marcus immediately, explaining what had happened. This is harassment, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. We can fight this. File a complaint with the hospital board, maybe even a lawsuit. Against the hospital? They're just following procedure. Against Richard. We can prove the allegations are false and that he's behind them. I considered this, weighing the additional battle against my already mounting challenges. Let me think about it, I said finally. In the meantime, I need to figure out how to pay my rent if this investigation drags on. The suspension is with pay, right? Focus on the IRS case for now. That's the bigger picture. He was right, of course. This was just a distraction, Richard's attempt to pressure me into backing down. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next few weeks settled into an uneasy rhythm. Each morning I woke, expecting some new attack from Richard, some fresh attempt to undermine me. Sometimes it came, strange calls in the night, a brick through Olivia's car window, rumors spreading through my professional network about my mental instability. Other days passed in tense silence, the waiting almost worse than the attacks themselves. Through it all, I focused on building my case stronger. I met regularly with Marcus and Eleanor, providing additional context for the documents I'd taken, explaining the patterns of fraud I'd observed over the years. I prepared for the inevitable IRS interviews, practicing how to explain what I knew and how I knew it. One rainy Tuesday, about a month after filing the report, I was leaving Eleanor's office when a sleek black car pulled up beside me. The window rolled down to reveal my mother's face, pale and drawn. "Get in," she said, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone. "Please." I hesitated, rain soaking through my jacket, before opening the door and sliding into the passenger seat. The car smelled of her perfume, the same scent she'd worn since I was a child, at once comforting and alienating. "How did you know where I was?" I asked, suddenly worried about Eleanor's safety, about the confidentiality of our meetings. "I had you followed," she admitted without apology. "I needed to talk to you, and you've blocked my number." For good reason. She turned to face me fully, and I was shocked by how much she had aged in just a few weeks. New lines etched her forehead and the corners of her mouth. The carefully maintained facade was cracking. "They raided his office yesterday," she said without preamble. "The IRS. They took computers, files, everything. They froze our accounts." I said nothing, watching raindrops race down the window beside me. "He was arrested this morning." That made me turn. "Arrested? Already?" She nodded, her hands twisting in her lap. A nervous gesture I'd never seen from her before. Apparently the evidence was substantial, enough for criminal charges. Tax evasion, wire fraud, money laundering. A strange mix of emotions swirled through me. Vindication, certainly, but also a hollow sadness for the woman sitting beside me, however complicit she might have been. "Did you know?" I asked quietly. "All these years, did you know what he was doing?" She stared straight ahead, her profile sharp against the gray light filtering through the window. "Not everything," she said finally. "Not the details. I knew his business operated in gray areas. I didn't ask questions. Because you didn't want to know. Because I wanted the life he gave us." Her voice cracked, the composure slipping. "The house, the status, the security. After your father died and left us with nothing, I promised myself I'd never be that vulnerable again." "Dad didn't leave us with nothing," I said, anger flaring. "He left his insurance money, enough for us to be comfortable." She laughed, a brittle sound. "Comfortable? Is that what you think? Your father's insurance barely covered his medical bills. We were drowning in debt when he died, Samantha. The house was mortgaged to the hilt. His business was failing. He left us nothing but memories and bills." This couldn't be true. My father had been responsible, careful with money. He'd talked about saving for my college, about the life insurance policy that would take care of us if anything happened to him. "You're lying," I said, but a seed of doubt had been planted. She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn envelope, handing it to me. "See for yourself. Your father's final bank statement, the insurance payout, and the medical bills. I kept them all these years, a reminder of why I made the choices I made." With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. The documents inside told the story my mother claimed: a mountain of debt, an insurance policy barely sufficient to cover the medical expenses, a bank account nearly empty. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered. "You were 8, Samantha. Then you were a teenager who idolized her father's memory. What good would it have done to tarnish that?" I stared at the papers, my certainties crumbling. All these years, I'd clung to the belief that my father had been perfect. Honest, responsible, everything Richard was not. The reality was more complicated. "This doesn't change what Richard did," I said finally, handing the envelope back to her. "Tax fraud is still a crime." "I'm not asking you to change what you've done," she said, surprising me. "It's too late for that. I'm asking you to understand why I stayed with him, why I prioritized him. Because he saved you from financial ruin. Because he represented security after my father left you vulnerable." The realization didn't erase the hurt of 20 years of being second best, but it cast it in a different light. "What happens now?" I asked. She put the envelope back in her purse with careful movements. "His lawyer is negotiating a plea deal. The house will be sold to pay restitution. Most of our assets will be liquidated." "And you?" She smiled faintly. "I have a sister in Arizona. She's offered me her guest room until I figure things out." The rain had stopped, weak sunlight breaking through the clouds. We sat in silence for a long moment, two women connected by blood, but separated by years of choices neither fully understood. "I should go," I said finally, reaching for the door handle. "Samantha." Her hand on my arm stopped me. "I wasn't a good mother, I know that. I made choices that hurt you, over and over. I can't change the past. But I want you to know, I'm proud of you. For standing up for what's right. Your father would be proud too." The words I'd longed to hear for so many years now landed with a bittersweet ache. Too little, too late perhaps. But not meaningless. "Goodbye, Mom," I said, stepping out of the car. As I watched her drive away, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but the beginning of understanding. The first step on a long road toward healing. Back at my apartment, I found a letter waiting from the hospital. The investigation had concluded, finding no evidence to support the allegations against me. I was cleared to return to work immediately. Another letter, this one from the IRS, confirmed that my whistleblower claim had been accepted and that a full investigation was underway. The process would be lengthy, they warned, but based on preliminary findings, they were pursuing both civil penalties and criminal charges. I sat on my balcony that evening, watching the sunset paint Portland's skyline in shades of gold and pink. The city felt different now, full of new possibilities rather than old constraints. My phone buzzed with a message from Olivia. "Dinner tomorrow to celebrate your return to work?" I smiled, typing back a quick, "Yes, please." Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the job listings I'd been browsing earlier. Nurse positions in Seattle, San Francisco, Denver. Cities where I could start fresh, build a life defined by my own choices rather than my family's shadow. My mother's revelation about my father had shaken me, forcing me to reconsider the narrative I'd built my life around. He hadn't been perfect. He'd made mistakes, taken risks that hadn't paid off, left his family vulnerable. But he'd also taught me about integrity, about doing what was right even when it was difficult. That part hadn't changed. I thought about Richard, likely sitting in a cell now, his empire crumbling around him. I thought about my mother, driving to Arizona to start over in her sister's guest room. I thought about myself, suspended between past and future, between the person I'd been and the person I was becoming. The whistleblower process would take time. Years, possibly. There would be interviews and depositions, perhaps even testimony if the case went to trial. Richard's legal team would fight every step of the way. It wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in 20 years, I felt free. Free from the weight of silence, from the burden of witnessing wrongdoing and doing nothing to stop it. Free from hoping for my mother's approval, from measuring my worth by her attention. Free to build a life that reflected my own values, not someone else's expectations. As darkness fell over the city, I made a decision. I would stay in Portland, at least until Richard's case was resolved. I would return to the hospital, holding my head high despite the whispers that would inevitably follow me. I would see this through to the end, not out of vengeance, but out of a commitment to truth. Messy, complicated, necessary truth. My father had taught me that numbers don't lie. What I was learning now was that people were more complex than balance sheets. They made mistakes. They chose wrong paths for understandable reasons. They hurt the people they loved. But they could also change, grow, find courage they didn't know they had. I had found mine. And whatever came next, I would face it standing in that courage, no longer silent, no longer invisible, no longer defined by someone else's choices. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through my bedroom window, casting patterns across my walls. For the first time in weeks, I felt rested, centered, ready for whatever the day might bring. My phone rang as I was making coffee. An unfamiliar number with a Washington, D.C. area code. I answered cautiously. Ms. Samantha Mitchell? A woman's crisp, professional voice. Speaking. This is Special Agent Lisa Hernandez, with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I've been assigned as lead investigator on the case you initiated against Richard Donovan. My pulse quickened. Yes? I'd like to schedule a meeting with you and your attorneys next week. Based on our preliminary review, this case is significant. Possibly one of the largest tax fraud schemes we've seen in the Pacific Northwest in decades. I'll be there, I said, a sense of purpose solidifying within me. Whatever you need. After arranging the details, I hung up and stood at my window, looking out at the city stretching before me. Somewhere out there, Richard was facing the consequences of his actions. Somewhere, my mother was driving toward a new and humbler life. And here, in this apartment that had once felt like a retreat from a family that didn't want me, I was finding my strength. I thought of that night in the ICU, bleeding and broken, when my mother chose Richard's party over my bedside. I thought of all the birthdays missed, the achievements unacknowledged, the 1,000 small ways I'd been made to feel secondary, disposable. But I also thought of my father's voice, gentle but firm. Do what's right, even when it's hard. I had done what was right. Finally, after 20 years of silence, I had spoken the truth. And though the road ahead might be long and difficult, I would walk it with my head held high, no longer defined by what I had lost, but by what I had found, my voice, my courage, my power to choose. The silence had ended, and in its place, something new was beginning. 6 months after my whistleblower report, I sat across from Special Agent Hernandez in a federal building downtown, watching as she organized a thick file of documents. The walls were bare except for government-issued certificates and a generic landscape print. No windows, just fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly sickly. The grand jury has returned an indictment, she said, sliding a document across the table. 37 counts of tax fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and filing false returns. I scanned the paper, the legal language dense but the meaning clear. Richard was facing serious charges that could put him in prison for decades. "What happens next?" I asked, handing the document back. Agent Hernandez leaned forward, her expression serious but satisfied. "Your stepfather's attorneys have approached the U.S. Attorney's Office about a plea deal. They know the evidence is overwhelming. He's looking at significant prison time regardless, but cooperation could reduce the sentence." I nodded, absorbing this information. Part of me had expected to feel triumphant at this moment, vindicated after years of being dismissed and sidelined by Richard. Instead, I felt something quieter, a steady certainty that I'd done the right thing, regardless of the personal cost. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. There's something else, Agent Hernandez continued, pulling another document from her file. The whistleblower reward. Based on the taxes, penalties, and interest we expect to recover, which is substantial, you're entitled to a percentage. She pushed a form toward me that included a number so large I had to read it twice to be sure I wasn't seeing things. Millions. The reward would be millions of dollars. I didn't do this for money, I stammered, still staring at the figure. Agent Hernandez's expression softened slightly. Few whistleblowers do. But the program exists for a reason. People who expose fraud often face professional and personal consequences. The reward acknowledges that sacrifice. She wasn't wrong. The months since filing the report had been challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated. While the hospital had reinstated me, the atmosphere had changed. Colleagues were cautious around me. Conversations stopped when I entered break rooms. Portland's business community, many of whom had connections to Richard, viewed me with suspicion or outright hostility. I'd received hate mail from strangers who'd read about the case in the newspaper, calling me ungrateful, disloyal, a family destroyer. There had been threatening phone calls that Marcus had reported to the police. Someone had even spray-painted "snitch" across my car one night. But there had been unexpected support too. Patients at the hospital who squeezed my hand and whispered, "Good for you." Anonymous letters from people who'd been victimized by similar schemes, thanking me for having the courage they hadn't found. A nurse from oncology who'd confided that her own brother was engaging in insurance fraud, and my example had given her the strength to report him. "The money isn't why I did it," I repeated, more to myself than to Agent Hernandez. "But I won't pretend it won't help." She nodded, understanding. "The final amount won't be determined until all the taxes are collected, which could take time. But this is a reasonable estimate." As I left the building and stepped into the crisp autumn air, my mind raced with possibilities I'd never allowed myself to consider. Financial security. Freedom. Options. For the first time since my father died, I wouldn't have to make choices based solely on what I could afford. Olivia was waiting at our favorite coffee shop, eager for updates. Her eyes widened as I shared the news about the indictment and the potential reward. "Holy shit, Sam," she whispered, mindful of other patrons nearby. "That's life-changing money." "It doesn't feel real," I admitted, wrapping my hands around my mug. "None of this does sometimes." "What will you do with it?" she asked. "Besides, buy me an extremely expensive thank you gift for letting you hide out at my place, of course." I laughed, grateful for her ability to lighten even the heaviest moments. "I've been thinking about that. Remember Michelle from the hospital, the nurse who lost her daughter to leukemia last year?" Olivia nodded. "Of course. She started a foundation to help families cover non-medical expenses during pediatric cancer treatment. Housing near hospitals, transportation, childcare for siblings. I want to make a significant donation." "That's perfect," Olivia said softly. "And I'm thinking about going back to school. Getting my nurse practitioner license, maybe specializing in trauma care." "Also perfect. What else?" I hesitated, my next thought still forming. I've been thinking about my mother. Olivia's expression shifted to concern. Have you heard from her? Not since that day in the car. But I looked up my aunt in Arizona. Mom's staying with her, working at a local department store. I paused, the words difficult to say aloud. I'm thinking about reaching out. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Olivia reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Are you sure that's what you want? I don't know, I admitted. But I keep thinking about what she told me, about Dad, about their finances after he died. It doesn't excuse how she treated me, but it helps me understand. And I don't want to carry this anger forever. Understanding doesn't have to mean reconciliation, Olivia reminded me gently. I know. But maybe it's a start. 2 weeks later, I boarded a plane to Phoenix, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach with each passing mile. I'd called my aunt first, unwilling to arrive unannounced. She'd sounded surprised but welcoming, confirming that my mother was still staying with her and working part-time at the cosmetics counter at Macy's. She's different, my aunt had said cautiously. Quieter. Less polished, I guess you could say. The fall has been hard on her. The Phoenix airport was a maze of sunlight and cacti-themed gift shops. I rented a car and navigated to my aunt's address in a modest neighborhood on the city's outskirts. The house was small but tidy, with desert landscaping and a bright blue door. My aunt answered on the first knock, enveloping me in a hug that smelled of coconut lotion and fabric softener. Samantha, she breathed. Look at you, all grown up and so beautiful. I hadn't seen her since I was a teenager, but her warm eyes and ready smile were the same. Unlike my mother, Aunt Carol had always been demonstrative with her affection, quick to hug or offer a compliment. Is she here? I asked quietly as she ushered me inside. Aunt Carol nodded. In the backyard. She likes to sit out there in the afternoons, watching the birds. She squeezed my arm. She doesn't know you're coming. I thought it might be better that way. The house was cozy and cluttered in a homey way. Family photos covering the walls, books stacked on end tables, so different from the sterile perfection my mother had maintained in her home with Richard. I moved through the living room to the sliding glass door that led to a small backyard patio. And there she was, sitting in a wicker chair, a paperback open in her lap, her face turned toward the sun. She looked smaller somehow, her carefully maintained blonde hair now showing streaks of gray at the temples, her clothes simple and unadorned. She must have sensed my presence because she turned, her book dropping to her lap as our eyes met. For a long moment, neither of us spoke or moved. Then she stood slowly, uncertainty written across her face. Samantha, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. What are you doing here? I stepped onto the patio, closing the door behind me. I wanted to see you. Her eyes searched my face, looking for what I wasn't sure. Anger? Triumph? Why? It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself repeatedly on the flight. Why come? Why now? The answer that had finally settled in my heart was simple but true. Because you are my mother, I said. And I think we have things to talk about. She gestured to the chair beside hers, and I sat, noticing the bird feeder hanging from a nearby tree, finches and sparrows darting to and from it. Richard took a plea deal, she said after a moment. 15 years. Eligible for parole in 8. I nodded. I heard. He blames you, says you betrayed the family. She turned to look at me directly. But we both know that's not true, don't we? He betrayed everything a family should stand for. Honesty, trust, loyalty. Her words stunned me. This was not the defense of Richard I'd expected, the accusation I'd braced myself for. I enabled him, she continued, her gaze shifting back to the birds. For years, I looked the other way. Told myself it was for our security, for our lifestyle. But the truth is, I was a coward. Too afraid to stand on my own 2 feet after your father died. Too afraid to face the financial mess he left us in. Mom, I started, but she held up a hand. Please, let me finish. I've had months to think about this, Samantha. Months of replaying every decision, every moment when I chose Richard over you. Her voice cracked slightly. There were so many. Too many. And I can't take a single one back. A lump formed in my throat, emotion rising unexpectedly. I didn't come for an apology. Then why did you come? I watched a finch land on the feeder, its tiny form vibrant against the desert landscape. I wanted to understand. I think I'm starting to. And I wanted to tell you something. She waited, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I'm receiving a whistleblower reward from the IRS. It's substantial. I paused, measuring my next words carefully. I've set up a trust fund for you. It's not a fortune, but it's enough that you won't have to work at Macy's unless you want to. Enough that you don't have to depend on anyone else. Her eyes widened, filling with tears. Why would you do that? After everything? The question hung in the air between us, weighted with 20 years of hurt and neglect, of choices that had broken what should have been unbreakable. Because that's what families should do, I said finally. Help each other stand on their own feet. She reached for my hand then, her fingers trembling slightly as they closed around mine. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the birds come and go, the sun moving slowly across the sky. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning. Later that evening, after my mother had gone to bed, I sat with Aunt Carol in her kitchen, nursing cups of herbal tea. You're a remarkable young woman, she said, studying me over the rim of her mug. Your father would be so proud of you. Even though I exposed his financial mistakes? The debt he left behind? She smiled softly. Especially because of that. James always valued truth above all else, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it reflected poorly on him. I wish I'd known that side of him, I said quietly. In my memories, he's perfect. He wasn't. None of us are. She reached across the table and patted my hand. But he loved you fiercely, and he believed in doing what was right no matter the cost. Just like you did. That night, in the guest room with its faded floral wallpaper and hand-knitted afghan, I dreamed of my father for the first time in years. Not the idealized version I'd clung to throughout childhood, but a more human one, capable of mistakes, of fear, of failure. And somehow, this version was more comforting, more real, than the perfect father I'd invented. When I returned to Portland the following week, I found a letter waiting from Marcus. The U.S. Attorney's Office had formally calculated my whistleblower award, $4, $2 million, to be paid once all taxes and penalties were collected from Richard's estate. I sat on my balcony, the letter in my hands, watching the city lights flicker on as dusk descended. The amount was staggering, life-altering, and yet it felt secondary to what I'd gained that couldn't be measured in dollars. My voice, my integrity, a tentative bridge to the mother I'd thought lost to me forever. Over the next year, as Richard's case moved through the legal system and his assets were liquidated to pay restitution, I rebuilt my life with deliberate care. I enrolled in a nurse practitioner program, specializing in trauma care. I made that substantial donation to Michelle's Pediatric Cancer Foundation. I bought a small house with a garden where I could grow vegetables and flowers, something I'd always wanted but never had space for in my apartment. My relationship with my mother evolved slowly, cautiously. We spoke weekly by phone. She visited Portland once, and the awkwardness gradually gave way to a fragile new understanding. Not the close bond I'd craved as a child, perhaps, but something honest, something real. The whistleblower reward finally arrived on a rain-soaked Tuesday, almost 2 years after I'd first sneaked into Richard's office and discovered the evidence of his fraud. By then, Richard was serving his sentence in a federal prison. My mother had moved into a small condo in Phoenix, financially independent for the first time in her adult life. And I was halfway through my nurse practitioner program, working part-time in the emergency department where my colleagues no longer whispered when I entered the room. Olivia and I celebrated with dinner at our favorite restaurant, raising glasses to endings and beginnings, to truth and consequences, to the unpredictable journey that had led me here. "Did you ever imagine this is where you'd end up?" she asked, as we walked home through the gentle rain afterward. 2 years ago, when you were deciding whether to report Richard, I considered the question, thinking about the frightened woman I'd been, silent for so long, accustomed to being overlooked, to being second best. How far that woman seemed from the person I'd become, stronger, more certain, more at peace. "No," I admitted. "I couldn't have imagined any of this. I just knew I couldn't stay silent anymore." "Well, I'm glad you found your voice," she said, linking her arm through mine. "It's a pretty powerful one." Later that night, as I stood in my garden despite the rain, I thought about the strange, winding path that had brought me here. How the worst betrayal, my mother choosing my stepfather over me time and again, had ultimately led to the greatest liberation. How speaking the truth, after 20 years of silence, had set me free in ways I never could have anticipated. I thought about my father, imperfect and human, who had nonetheless taught me the value of integrity. I thought about my mother, slowly finding her way back to herself after decades of dependence and denial. I thought about Richard, paying for his crimes in a cell far from the mansion he'd built on fraud and lies. And I thought about myself, no longer defined by what I'd lost or what had been withheld from me, but by the choices I'd made, the stand I'd taken, the truth I'd spoken. The rain fell softly around me, nurturing the seeds I'd planted, the new life taking root beneath the soil. Some would call what I'd done revenge, but it had never been about that. It had been about justice, about truth, about refusing to be complicit in wrongdoing through my silence. It had been about honoring the values my father had instilled in me, even as I came to see him more clearly, more honestly. In the end, exposing my stepfather's fraud hadn't just been about bringing him to justice. It had been about reclaiming my own story, writing an ending that reflected not what had been done to me, but what I had chosen to do in response. Not a victim's tale, but a hero's journey, from silence to voice, from powerlessness to agency, from fear to courage. The rain eased, clouds parting to reveal a scatter of stars above my garden. I took a deep breath of the clean, wet air, feeling rooted and whole in a way I never had before. The path forward wasn't perfect or certain, but it was mine to choose, mine to create, one honest step at a time. And that, I realized, was the greatest reward of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.